Hello, everyone. A big welcome to all of you. My name is Laura, and I'm delighted that you are joining us for today's ESPC Hot Seat webinar. Today, I am joined by Tom Morgan, who will talk to you guys about Microsoft 365 development. Tom is here to answer your burning questions, so don't hold back. If you have a question for Tom, please raise your hand and I will enable your mic and you can ask Tom your question. Or alternatively, of course, you can pop your questions into the question box and I will shout them out. We love hearing what you guys have to say, so remember to join in on the conversation about today's Hot Seat webinar and more on Twitter. Our handle is @ESPC Community and our hashtag is #ESPC23. So tweet us, at us, and let us know if you enjoyed having your questions answered. Don't forget to check out our resource centre, which is updated daily with the latest blogs, ebooks, webinars, and how-to videos. You can access and view the resource centre by visiting our website, sharepointeurope.com, and clicking the content tab at the top. Do you have questions about SharePoint framework that you want answers to? Well, the next person to take the hot seat is Vesa Juvonen next Wednesday, the 22nd of November at 1 p.m. CET. Vesa will take on your sizzling questions on all things SharePoint framework, so be sure to attend live to get your questions answered in real time. ESPC is fast approaching. If you are looking for a vibrant Microsoft 365 and Azure conference that is jam-packed with groundbreaking insights, visionary keynotes, hands-on workshops, and exciting networking opportunities, then it is time to secure your early bird tickets for ESPC. But why should you attend ESPC? Well, you can receive valuable insights by attending a variety of session types across the biggest Microsoft 365 and Azure topics. Hear from Microsoft product team members, regional directors, MVPs, MCMs, and independent experts. ESPC is also a great way to build your professional network and meet like-minded people from across the globe. ESPC also helps you to keep up and get ahead with the latest product developments and practices that matter the most. And of course, you can always expect the latest news straight from Ignite. So invest in your team, invest in yourself, and invest in your career by learning new skills or mastering current ones at ESPC. Don't let this opportunity slip away. So book now before it is too late. Tom will also be speaking on Azure Communication Services, a guide for developers at ESPC in less than 2 weeks' time. Azure Communication Services is changing how developers think about working with previously complicated domains such as voice, video, desktop sharing, multi-party meetings, SMS, media manipulation, and more. There are a lot of things to discover, and it can be hard to know what can be done and where to start. So make sure you join Tom at ESPC for an introductory tour of this exciting new world that is still evolving and growing. You can find out more about Tom's session at sharepointeurope.com/conference schedule 2023. Again, if you have a question at any stage, feel free to raise your hand or type it into the questions window and Tom will be sure to answer it. This hot seat webinar will be recorded and added to the resource centre where you will be notified by email when it is available. And now I'm going to pass over to our very first hot seat guest, Tom. Hello, Tom.
Hello, Laura. Thank you very much. Hello to everyone who's joining us. I'm hoping you're here because you've got questions, because I don't have a particular agenda. I don't have a bunch of stuff I want to get off my chest. So I'm hoping you're here because you've got questions. I would encourage you to raise your hand and let's talk about them rather than typing. If you want to type and chat, that's totally fine. But also you could save your fingers because why not? We can just have a conversation about it. So who's going to be first is always a good question. Once the first one starts, they all fall. So, and then you're waiting in line. So don't be that person. If you've got a question, stick your hand up. It'd be good to hear. We can cover all sorts of things. We can cover Microsoft 365 development, obviously, which covers so many different things now, doesn't it? I come from the Microsoft Teams side of things. I've come up through Skype for Business. And I've been a developer in that world for over 10 years now, probably more like 15. But there's lots of other places we could go. Jolanda, perfect. Yes, I don't know what magic we need to do to unmute you, but I think you can now unmute yourself, Jolanda, and ask a question.
Hello. I just was wondering, how do you start with development on 365? Because you have SharePoint where you can develop things. In the past, we have VBA, and now it's other things that you can do online. But how do I start?
Yeah, great question. How do you start in Microsoft 365 development? It can be quite intimidating because it's so, there's so many different places you could go and there's so many different things you could do. Some of that is going to depend on what you want to do. For instance, I would, if you're coming into this completely new, I would maybe start by having a look at Microsoft Graph, which is not super exciting maybe, but it's a really good baseline to understand some of the capabilities. Microsoft Graph is the API that kind of underlines a lot of this development work, and understanding how that API works, how you authenticate to it, how you write applications against it, what the permission model looks like, and then all of the different things you can do gives you a really good grounding for, okay, fundamentally I can understand how I can either get data out of Microsoft 365 or how I can manipulate things inside Microsoft 365, because Graph can let you do both of those things. You can access, let's say you want to access data inside a team or a channel, you can do that in Graph, but you could also use Graph to create new channels or create new files or move files around, or even create SharePoint news sites. There's lots of different things you can do with it. So understanding what you can do with Graph is a kind of I think a fundamental. After that, you could take your development in lots of different places. If you want to go and become a SharePoint developer, you could actually sort of focus in on that. If you just don't know where to go but you want to sort of start somewhere, I think if you're entering this today, a really interesting place to go would be to look at building either Microsoft Graph connectors or Microsoft Teams messaging extensions. And there's a very specific reason I chose those two things. Those are the two ways right now that developers can build for Copilot. Now, it's only been 7 minutes into this that we mentioned Copilot, and we've got obviously Microsoft Ignite coming soon as well. Copilot is obviously the real focus of what Microsoft are talking about at the moment. But what does that mean for developers? There are places developers and things developers can do to develop for Copilot, but two of those right now are those connectors for Microsoft Graph and messaging extensions. Connectors, the way Microsoft Graph works is, like I say, it's a big API across all of your Microsoft 365 data. So everything that happens in Microsoft 365, and I don't just mean the files and the folders and the team stuff and the SharePoint stuff, actually your organizational information, all of your OneDrive information, even information about devices, if you use Intune, all of those, all that devices, the signals, what you're doing, all that intelligence that used to be called Delve, about who is talking to who and who's sharing files with who, all the security stuff, all of that stuff is accessible to you in Graph. There's another sort of side to this though, is that you can take your own data that is not in Graph. Let's say you've got third-party data, I don't know, some accounting system or CRM or Workday or whatever it is, or some, I don't know, big store of knowledge that your organization has in a database somewhere. You can take that and you can plug it into Graph using a Graph connector. Why would you want to do that? Well, the sort of primary reason about a year ago I would have told you to do this is that it makes searching in Microsoft 365 smarter. So when you do a search in Microsoft 365, not only do you get all the results about your files and your documents, you would also get pointers to that external data source. So it will index that for you. So for users, it's one place to go, and it can really help that. But the other big reason now is that data from connectors also powers Copilot. So if you're thinking about, or you think you might have a future that involves using Microsoft 365 Copilot, having that data come into Graph will mean that Copilot will have access to it. So as a developer, that's one area really strongly I would go and look at. If you've got, you're an organization that's got lots of data outside of Microsoft Graph or outside of Microsoft 365, I would look to bring it in using connectors, because then you you know that you're well set up for a Copilot future. And even if you never end up using Copilot, the search you do inside Microsoft 365 is going to be that much better. So that's one area. The other area is Microsoft Teams messaging extensions. So this is a bit more real development, I guess. In the connectors are real development too, but they're quite back end, right? Messaging extensions are front end developers. It's something that you will see and users will see and interact with. You can make a Microsoft Teams app that contains these messaging extensions. Messaging extensions are when you go and create and compose a message in a channel or one-to-one, down at the bottom where you type the text in, down at the bottom, you've got options for what you can add things to the message. So it's where you find the emojis and the GIFs and stuff like that. But you can add your own thing in there as well. And so you can, let's say we come back to our third-party data store. We've got like a big database of, I don't know, product information maybe. You can write a messaging extension that sits there and users can click on when they're composing a message, and it can pop up a little dialogue. They can search for a product. It searches in that third-party product database. They can choose it, and then it will put a really nicely formatted adaptive card into the composed message for them just to send, that pulls information out from that system, or whatever system it is, and displays it exactly as you want. And there you go. They're called messaging extensions because when they were built, that's what they were used for, right? They're enhancing messages and composing of messages, and they're a useful way to go. The reason I'm recommending them is that's the other extensibility point for Copilot. So you'll be able to take the messaging extensions you built, and if you've already built messaging extensions, by the way, this is also true. Like, you can still do this today. You can take those, make some changes to the manifest, and they can be used in Copilot. Copilot can understand the functionality they have and then call on it if it needs to augment its answers. So for those two reasons, I think I would focus in on those. I can talk more about that, but I'm gonna pause and say, if people want to come back, ask more questions, now's a good time to raise your hand. Otherwise, I'll carry on talking on that subject. But I don't want to kind of just keep talking the whole time. Does that make sense, Joanna?
Yeah, thank you, Tom. But can you advise a training for this?
Yeah,
Also?
absolutely. So there's lots of training. So the best place I would start is Microsoft Learn. So if you go and search Microsoft Learn for Microsoft Teams and messaging extensions, you'll find a few different things. You'll find an overview page that just kind of covers what they are and where to go. And then you'll find a series of walkthroughs that will tell you how to build your first messaging extension. What they will do is point you towards Visual Studio Code and then the Teams toolkit. So I will try and find some links whilst we're talking and put them into the chat because there's some really good walkthroughs. Visual Studio Code plus the Teams toolkit is a really nice way to get started, because the Teams toolkit will scaffold for you a new messaging extension that's got all of the kind of plumbing and everything built in, so it works straight away. So you just have to worry about adding your bits into it. Let me just really quickly make sure this is the right link before I put it into the chat. Yeah, it's not, but that's okay. We can talk about it anyway. So let me just show you what I mean. So this link I've just put in the chat. In fact, if I share my screen, I can you can see what I'm talking about. So I just want to show you this blog post real quick, because that's what I was just talking about around building messaging extensions for Teams and Copilot. It's got some good screenshots of what they look like, but it's also really kind of the reason for this blog post really is announcing that you can use these extensions with Copilot. This is what I mean down here. As you're creating those messages, you can pop this open. You could do a search. This one looks like it's searching Azure DevOps. And then when you do that, it will nicely put it into the chat, just like this one here, So there's a great answer to your question here, actually. Teams Toolkit. So you find Teams Toolkit inside Visual Studio Code. If you go to Visual Studio Code and then go to Extensions, search for Teams Toolkit, then you're off to the races. You need a tenant to build it on, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then this actually walks you through how to get started using exactly what I just said, actually. Creating a messaging extension from the template, it will do that scaffolding for you. There's also I'm just going to go through and see if they've got a link, but that's a good one to follow right there. And then this was the other one I was thinking about, this link here, which I shall put in the chat as well. So this gives you like a good starting place for understanding what they are, and then I think at the bottom of here somewhere it's got some code samples. That's what I was looking for. So if you want to, if you're the sort of person that works better just downloading a project in code and seeing how it all hangs together, then you could do that as well. And you've got a variety of different languages you can choose as well. Doesn't always have to be .NET. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yep. Thank you.
Cool. Anyone else got a question? This is a good time to raise your hand. Otherwise, I shall talk about something that crossed my mind a few minutes ago. Okay, I'm going to start talking. But if you have a question, put your hand up, and we'll come back to you when I finish talking. One of the things that crossed my mind as we were talking through that is you might be in an organization where some of this stuff is going to be a little tricky if you have quite restricted access in your organization. And one of the things you will want to do quite early on, especially if you're building messaging extensions, is sideload your application. Sideloading is when you're installing an app into Microsoft Teams that didn't come from any of the app stores. It didn't come from your organizational app store, and it didn't come from the big Teams app store. And so, which makes sense, right? You've just built this app on your computer, on your workstation, and now you want to run it in Teams. You're not ready to put it into the App Store. You're running it for the first time. So you kind of need to press F5 and have it build and run in your Teams instance. That's called sideloading. Now, that can be turned off by administrators and often is in organizations for security reasons. If that's a problem, then either you can go and hassle your IT admin, but what might be quicker is the Microsoft 365 Developer Sandbox program. Or developer program. Microsoft have a program for developers where they will give you a tenant that you can use to develop on. And it's one that you've got full admin rights over, and you don't have to pay for it. As long as you do some development work in it every 90 days or so, it keeps renewing. You're not allowed to use it for any production stuff, but it can be an absolute lifesaver if you just know that you're going to have problems in your organization and in your tenant getting access to stuff. So I'm going to put a link to that because it's a really good deal from Microsoft. They'll give you a 25 E5 user accounts. You can have it pre-configured with a bunch of demo data as well, because that's another challenge actually, especially if you're looking around Graph as well. If you've got a very small tenant or you're like a 1-2 person company, Graph can be quite an empty place. And if you just want to understand how some of the APIs work, you need real data. So yeah, this will give you it's a full sandbox that you can use for development. Like I say, 25 users. It's all set up with all the settings to allow sideloading, which is nice. So you haven't got to figure out, where to go in the admin center to turn it all on. It's got a bunch of sample users and data all sort of set up, and it's got all of the main Office 365 applications in it as well. So yeah, as long as you keep using it, it will keep renewing. Yeah, you don't have to just use it for Teams development. It's very good for SharePoint development as well. It's good for all sorts of things. So yeah, yes, that's definitely worth checking out.
It works very good.
Good. I'm glad you know about it already. Yes, but it is good. Good. All right. Any other questions? Or I can just carry on rambling. I'm good with that.
There is just a question in here in the question box, Tom, so I might just shout it out to you.
Sure.
So someone wants to know, in the Microsoft Developer Program, it states that your subscription will be auto-renewed or extended in 90-day increments if you're actively developing. What is considered active development? And do you need to be working in more than one product or workload? And do you need activity every day?
Yeah. So yeah, it's a good question. So the official answer is Microsoft don't tell you what actively developing means. They don't have that written down. It's fairly loose. You definitely don't need to do something every day. As long as you're doing something, I think. As what I've found with my developer sandbox is that if I'm publishing and I'm sideloading an app once every couple of weeks, it's never been a problem. And also, before it becomes a problem, they will email you and say, we're not seeing any activity in your sandbox. Are you still using it? Do you still want it? They'll give you warning. They won't just turn it off. So that's definitely worth sort of remembering. But I've never found it a problem. I wouldn't worry too much about it. I think they sort of take, what they don't want is people just having it and then just never using it again. But I think if you're logging into it, if you do some side loading, if you're using, let's say, Teams, as if you're using the app in Teams a bit, then I think you're going to be absolutely fine. Cool. Anyone else got any questions? I could probably go and find the. Oh, I've raised my hand. That was a mistake.
There's just another question in here, Tom. Sorry, I'll just shout it out again to you.
That's cool. I should probably look it up
myself.
Sorry.
No, you're okay. Are you expecting any big news on Microsoft 365 development from Microsoft Ignite?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I did a blog post a couple of days ago about my kind of top my top sessions that I was looking forward to from Microsoft Ignite. Big news for Microsoft 365 development. I'm actually going to say I'm not expecting anything groundbreaking, and here's why. Microsoft do like to hold stuff back for like big events like Ignite and Build. And I do think there will be some announcements that come out for developers at Ignite, but it's not the developer conference. So there's that, Build is the developer conference. Ignite is supposed to be the IT Pro conference, but more and more it's got developer stuff in it. But the main reason is everything at the moment is about Copilot, and everything is Copilot. And the pace of change has been so fast. I think for a lot of this stuff, actually, Microsoft haven't wanted to wait for something like Ignite. They've got it out as it's become available. So this stuff is coming out kind of hot. So it's not being held. So I'm looking through the sessions for Ignite. Kind of trying to see what there is and see what's available. Looking through the sessions for developers, I see sessions on how you can build messaging extensions for Copilot, like we've just talked about. I see sessions about how you can integrate your external data sources with Copilot, as we've just been talking about. I don't see lots of other sessions around Microsoft 365 development. Not to say they're not going to be there, but I'm not expecting anything huge that isn't already Copilot related that's there. One area that might be interesting and keeping an eye on is what's happening in Azure Communication Services, which is not strictly Microsoft 365 development, but I kind of always include it because if you're a developer, it doesn't really matter what program it falls under or which Microsoft organization it belongs to. It's still useful development. Those folks are doing some really interesting things in the chat and the voice space for developers, and they haven't sort of made any really big announcements involving AI yet. So I think that might be something interesting to keep an eye on. It's reminded me actually of something that did come out a few months ago now that would, I think, in any other year, if it wasn't so Copilot focused, would probably have been held for Ignite. And that's the Teams AI library. So this is a different way in Microsoft 365 for developers to build bots on Teams that are linked to large language models. Now, you could take the way that you've always built bots before and tie them up to a large language model. Of course you could. The Teams AI library is a slightly different implementation of doing this. It's a different way of using the bot framework. And I think it's going to become the standard for people who want to build bots that are linked to large language models, but with their own prompts and with their own data and their own groundings, to kind of quickly and easily create nice bots that can answer questions well. So the Teams AI library, I didn't actually see many sessions or any sessions on it actually. I didn't see any sessions on it, I don't think, at Ignite. But that if what I'm saying is news to you, go check. See if I've got a link for the Teams AI library. I have, because if you're building a bot from scratch today, you probably want to link it to a large language model, and that's probably what you're going to do. So it's worth understanding the Teams AI library because it can really make your life a lot easier. So yes. Any more questions? As Ella says, there's 6 minutes to go. Oh, I should check the Q&A. I can do that myself now. I found it. Oh, good question about if you build something on the developer program trial, can you transfer the build to your paid account? Yes and no. So it is a separate tenant. So what Microsoft is doing is literally creating you a new tenant. So you can't transfer settings or apps or anything in that way from one tenant to the other. However, what I would do is start off with your developer tenant, set up Visual Studio Code, to set it up in your GitHub that's all production, or however it is you're doing your source control and all that, and just deploy to the developer tenant. So when you do that, so Teams Toolkit can help you do this, because all of the YAML files, because they use YAML now to describe the environment, which is quite nice. When you build something using the Teams Toolkit, you get these YAML files that describe what's going to happen on the tenant in terms of building, provisioning the application. So you can do that to your developer tenant, and then when you're ready to move it to your main tenant, all you need to do is just update in Visual Studio Code, update the tenant, like sign in basically to your production tenant, and then you can use that same manifest, same deployment, and then you'll just deploy what you've written to your production tenant, and off you go from there. Another question about, do you need to have a good understanding of Microsoft Visual Studio for Microsoft 365 development? No, you absolutely don't. Either Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code, you don't need to have a good understanding of how they work. If you don't want to. You don't even have to use them if you don't want to. So there's lots and lots of different options. If you are comfortable using some other IDE, that is absolutely fine. If you're comfortable using something that's not .NET, actually what you'll find is, let's say, Microsoft Graph and all of the Teams, so building Teams bots, Teams messaging extensions, all the stuff I've talked about, they have SDKs for Java and Ruby and PHP and lots of different languages. So you don't even have to use .NET if you don't want to. If you are using .NET, you could use Visual Studio, you could use Visual Studio Code. You don't have to use either. The Visual Studio Code and also Visual Studio, come with the Teams toolkit I keep going on about. That will help you. It does make some things easier, and it shortcuts you needing to know quite so much about the back-end plumbing about how things work, which you can kind of come to later, but otherwise you've got to kind of learn all of that stuff before you even deploy your first app, whereas the Teams Toolkit helps some of that by abstracting some of it away for you. That's the only kind of reason I would say to take a look at Visual Studio or Code. And if you've not used either and you want to pick one, I would say Visual Studio Code probably has the lower barrier to entry. It just feels slightly more lightweight. Like, I'm more comfortable with Visual Studio Code because I've used it for 20 something years. I'm kind of old school like that. The people in my team, many of them have never used Visual Studio Code. They all love, they've never used Visual Studio. They all love Visual Studio Code. And lots of developers who are not Microsoft developers, they build out on AWS, and they build they build in PHP or they build in Ruby, whatever. They're using Visual Studio Code because they like it as an IDE. It's fast, it's well updated, it's got lots of support for lots of different things. So it's worth taking a look at, but you absolutely don't need to use it. Cool. We have, I think, 1 minute left. If anyone wants to come in with a question real quick. We didn't even talk about... Oh, sorry.
Oh, no. Go on, Tom.
All I was going to say is we didn't even talk about publishing to the App Store. We didn't talk about certifying apps. We didn't talk about monetizing apps. Those are sometimes good questions, but we can always come back to that, especially if you're going to be at ESPC. You can come and find me and we can talk about those things.
Yeah, exactly. So that seems to be all the questions that we have in. So just a huge thank you to you, Tom, for answering everyone's questions. There were some fantastic questions in there today, and it is great to be able to get some answers in real time from someone with a strong knowledge on the topic. So just on behalf of the ESPC community, we want to say a huge thanks, Tom, for carrying out this hot seat webinar, the first of many. We really do appreciate it.
No worries. Thank you
So
for having
that
me.
is no problem at all. That is the end of today's rapid fire Q&A hot seat. You can find this recording and more at sharepointeurope.com/resource centre, and you will be notified by email when it is available. So that is it for today, folks. Thanks again to everyone for joining us today. Take care, and we hope that you'll join us again next week.